Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Stephen Knott, the author of Conspirator in Chief, the long tradition of conspiracy theories in the American presidency. This is, from what I can tell, about his 10th book on the presidency, and he is an emeritus professor of national security at the Naval War College. Professor, thanks so much for being back for your third time. You are now tied with Lindsay Chervinsky, Megan Kate Nelson, and Kate Anderson Brower. So that's a nice group to be in.
That's very elite company, Evan, and it's always a pleasure to be with you.
Glad to have you again. Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And also, AxelbankHistory.com is designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, our featured episodes, and also a link to that Patreon page. So check out Nikki's work. Doctor, your key quote is from Lincoln. Who else, right? The survival of our experiment depends on the citizenry's commitment to reason, to cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason. Yet you say that conspiracy theories are the opposite of reason, and they're not an exception in the presidency, but rather a feature of the presidency. And from the crummiest, Andrew Johnson, to the top tier, FDR, presidents seem to be obsessed with unprovable plots against them. Those plots cause them to harm themselves politically and mentally, but also, probably more importantly, they cause harm to our country, to our state. So, first of all, Professor, how do we tell where reality ends and conspiracy begins?
Yeah, it's an incredibly good and difficult question, Evan. I guess one place to start possibly would be for presidents and all of us to refrain from circulating things without evidence. I think the difference between a conspiracy theory and something that's rooted in fact is that there is evidence to justify certain statements. But if you're out there claiming that, John F. Kennedy was murdered by God knows who, some conspiracy, you've got to produce evidence. So, and I think presidents in particular have a real responsibility since they really can influence millions of people. And it's one thing for some guy in a basement somewhere with a tinfoil hat to be circulating conspiracy theories, but it's another thing for the president from the bully pulpit to spread these things. And again, they tend to be adopted by the American people because Americans still, I think, for the most part, trust their presidents. So I would say, again, Evan, the dividing line is evidence. Show me your evidence. Show me your reasoned argument, as opposed to a conspiracy theory, which usually lacks any sort of hard evidence.
What have you discovered about the constitutional structure of our government, the three branches, and also the power that the presidency's Article 2 contains that makes belief in conspiracy theory not just possible, but likely?
I think primarily, Evan, it's due to the fact, especially in the case of the American presidency, now that selecting a president is based almost entirely on name recognition, on the ability of a candidate to move the public through appeals to passion and through appeals to conspiracy theories, we've geared our system in such a way that we reward those folks who can move vast swaths of public opinion. That's not, by the way, what the framers intended. They were actually fearful of that kind of presidential selection process. So we have an electoral system that currently rewards those who can appeal to our base passions through conspiracy theories.
So talk about those founders. Did they ever consider, and how did they consider, banning speech in the public that was conspiratorial? Did they believe that there should be safeguards? Or do we have evidence that allowing or even promoting the rights of the people to speak out was essential to them, even if it was for the lack of a better term, crazy?
It was, I think, essential to all of them. They were all believers in free speech, although there were some founders, the Federalists, in particular John Adams, who favored certain restrictions on speech. But the difference, Evan, is that most of these founders, with the exception of Jefferson, believed that it was absolutely vital for people in positions of high authority not to circulate these kinds of things, to engage in a kind of rhetorical restraint, to remain silent if need be. It's so easy to stir the pot. It's so easy to be a demagogue. It can win you votes, but it's not good for the health of the republic.
So is the constitutional structure there just the fact that the presidency has so many powers and presides over such a large swath, not just of the civilian part of the government, but the military part of the government, that conspiracy theory then inherently becomes dangerous because they just have the ability to not just place people, but also to control what messages get out?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And because of that, because that presidents like Washington and John Quincy Adams were well aware of the influence that presidents have, they did exercise this restraint. They were moderate in the kind of statements they made because they understood the damage that can be done by a president spreading misinformation.
You say that there are four major modern events that have created these sort of endless conspiracy theories. Some of them have resulted in deadly, violent consequences. But the four of them are the JFK assassination, the moon landing. Actually, one of the people who did land on the moon punched a guy because of the moon conspiracy
Yes.
theory, if you remember that. So that's a piece of
Yes.
violence. But Buzz Aldrin, JFK, the moon landing, 9/11, and January 6th. Does the tendency for an intuition among the American public that there must be a conspiracy theory, does that flow downward from the presidency or does it flow upward from the public?
Evan, I think it flows both ways. That may sound like a cop out, but some of the presidents I discuss in this book were well aware of the rumors that were already circulating at the grassroots and understood that they could tap into those rumors. They could benefit from them by seeming to identify with the man or woman on the street. So I would say it's a two-way street, Evan, although I would point out, I think with January 6th in particular, had President Trump not beaten the drum so often that that election was stolen, I mean, there would have always been folks out there who
Sure, I
believed it
think that's
was,
pretty clear. Yeah.
but he's the one who gave it legitimacy. He still repeats it, and because of that, millions of Americans no longer have any faith in our electoral process, and that's a shame.
You chose eight presidents that made conspiracy theories a feature of their time in office. We're going to go through each of them one by one. But just first here in the beginning, I just want to, some of the names surprised, will surprise our listeners as they did me. Thomas Jefferson is on that list, the great Thomas Jefferson in some ways. Andrew Jackson, Andrew Johnson, probably not a surprise to some people. Woodrow Wilson, FDR, a revered president. Harry Truman, another revered president, particularly recently. Richard Nixon, probably not a surprise. And then, of course, Donald Trump. How did you narrow it down from 45 men? We don't say 47 because there literally are 45 men who have been in the presidency. Two are counted twice. What was your standard to say that this president demanded a chapter? In other words, how did you weed out the other, what is it, 37?
Terrific question, and I have to say, Evan, this was perhaps the toughest challenge of all.
It's a lot of contenders.
There's a lot of contenders, and some of the folks who didn't make my list, the list that you just mentioned, came very close. So I will confess there is a kind of subjective quality to the people I chose here. But look, all of them had a number of things in common. There was no sort of growth in office. In other words, the kind of person they were as a candidate, or at least in Jefferson's case, as somebody who made it clear that he was interested in being president. There's no change whatsoever. Assuming that high station of the presidency doesn't lead a Jefferson or a Jackson, or sadly an FDR, who I also admire in part, to change their practices. So there's no growth in office. There's a tendency to view their opponents as the personification of evil. Thus, it's okay to do whatever it takes to stop them, including spreading malicious lies. There's just a number of threads between those 8 that you mentioned that led me in the end to include those folks in the book.
All right. So before we get to those 8, I just have a few questions about how you put this all together, and we are going to go through each one. First of all, how did this work flow from your previous books, particularly The Lost Soul of the American Presidency? That, you hit presidents in that one for being willing to seize on the fears of the people as opposed to appealing to reason, um, and for creating passion where passion need not be. And then also from the book that you did on, I guess, the king of presidential conspiracy fodder, at least, if he didn't believe in them himself, JFK. How did the work on those two lead you to this sort of tip of the spear?
Definite outgrowth, Evans, from both of those works, particularly The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, where I focused strictly on demagoguery and found time after time after time that conspiracy theories, conspiracy mongering, if you will, was part of that demagoguery. And that's what got me onto it. The JFK book, not quite perhaps as connected, but Kennedy, I think, was, despite whatever flaws he may have had, a child or an adult who worshiped reason, who respected intellectuals, who wasn't fearful of people around him who might be smarter than he was. And he had a real contempt for those folks who circulated unfounded conspiracy theories. And in his day, it was the John Birch Society. It was a lot of far right extremist groups who viewed him as a communist and viewed Washington as the ground zero for the deep state. And Kennedy found that to be just such an anti-intellectual stance that he actually spoke out against it, including, Evan, as I'm sure you're aware, a few references in that speech he would have delivered at the Dallas Trade Mart had he not been murdered, where he appealed to the people of Dallas and the United States to worship, in a sense, reason.
And he, in particular, was on the record previous to this final speech that he never gave, but he was on the record as saying society should not wait for the man on horseback to come and save it. I mean, he was very clear that
Yes,
conspiracy theory could lead to the savior mentality.
that is exactly right. No question about it, Evan. And not only did he take on the John Birch Society, he also took, and the John Birch Society was one of the leading proponents of a popular conspiracy theory at the time, that fluoridation of the water supply was a communist plot. I mean, I know it sounds laughable, and it is, of course. And Kennedy actually addressed that as president and just found it just head scratching that
Wouldn't
people
it
would buy into this.
wouldn't it have been something that if when the wall fell, if all the fluoride was pulled out of our water? And fear not, folks, if you want to hear about those two books, we do have our previous episodes with Dr. Knott are on those books, and I'll get the episode numbers for you. But we're up to over 200 now, if you can believe it. I think we were on, like, you might have been on 10 or 12 or something like that. So
Yeah.
many years ago. Well, not that many, 5-6 years ago. Why have previous scholars shied away from analyzing this part of the presidential mind, particularly when it comes to the more revered presidents on your list: Jefferson, FDR, Truman?
Well, I think you put your finger on it, Evan. I think for a number of scholars, particularly those who might admire Jefferson or an FDR or Truman for that matter, it's an aspect of their careers that's not particularly it's a negative. It's a blot on their record. And I'm not necessarily accusing these people of playing favorites, so to speak. But look, if you have a book where the thesis is essentially this person is a great man, these kinds of things that I'm talking about don't lend themselves to that assessment.
Yeah, I guess, right. You wind up with a great guy, but he also was a crazy loon who was into conspiracy theories. All right, what sources did you find yourself using? Are you analyzing their writings? Are you looking at new papers from the day? Or are there some other things that you did with oral history and what have you?
Yeah, it would be all the above, Evan, all of the above. It would be presidential speeches. Obviously, with the 19th century presidents, you have to go to places like Founders Online and the Library of Congress online, things of that sort. And then, of course, newspapers, which were the main vehicle that Jefferson and Jackson and Andrew Johnson, to some extent, used to circulate conspiracy theories. So, yeah, there was a lot of boring time. Although I shouldn't say that. I actually kind of enjoy it. But,
You'd
plowing
have to
through,
enjoy it after 10 books.
you have to. You have to. Just plowing through documents gets a little easier in modern times since you can find a lot of these things, video recordings, etc., White House tapes, etc.
I just looked it up on our archive here. You were on episode number 16 on
Okay.
October of 2020, and you were on episode 105 in November of 2022. So
Terrific. And
here you are.
congratulations, Evan, on episode 200.
Thank you, thank you. That's a nice gesture. Lastly, before we get into the presidents, I want to ask, why do you seem to write books that are right around this 200-page mark? Is there something about that size that works for you that you find is digestible to the mind?
It is, and it's partly just exhaustion, Evan. Well, that's a little bit of a flippant response, but I think for most readers, that's an adequate length to make the point that I'm trying to make. The book does include about 38 pages of endnotes, so I don't want people to think that I'm just sort of spouting this stuff off the top of my head. It's deeply rooted in all sorts of sources. But again, in my view, that's an appropriate length for a book like this.
What do you have a critique when you're reading books? Do you find yourself saying this doesn't need to be 450 pages? They could have done it in 375. Do you
Uh,
find yourself feeling that, or do you have a different sort of view when you're reading a book as
uh,
opposed to writing one?
I often do, Evan. I have to say, both with books and movies, I find myself saying, in the case of a movie, that could have been a half an hour shorter. And the same with some books. Now, look, obviously, in certain cases, there's certain subjects that require a heck of a lot more than 200 or 300 pages. But yeah, I find myself making that critique quite often, Evan.
Has that changed for you as technology has changed and as our attention spans
Yeah.
have been winnowed by the technology around us?
Terrific question, and I suppose that's very possible, and it's an angle I haven't considered, but it is quite possible. I spend far too much time on social media, so maybe I'm a victim of those somewhat dangerous trends where we expect to be entertained in a very brief period of time.
Yeah, it's like everybody else is crazy for going on social media except yourself, right?
That's
Uh,
right.
um, all right. I want to give you a chance here to weigh in on each of the eight presidents that you mentioned here. You can give a primer, but I have also have some specific questions on each. Jefferson, you say that he was the first president, and by the way, you dedicate one chapter to each of them. But you say that he was the first president, Jefferson was, to practice personal destruction. So he was third, but he was first in the pool on that. He used conduits, you say, to hammer his nemesis, Alexander Hamilton. And he also felt by the end of his life that efforts to contain slavery were the result of a conspiracy led by his Federalist opponents to oppress the South, as you put it. And that seems to be a theme, a racial theme that comes up
Yes.
with conspiratorial presidents. How did he sort of miss this founder's anti-demagogue message, particularly the message of George Washington?
Because, Evan, I think Jefferson, being more of a believer in the wisdom of the people and more rooting his power, in a sense, in a mandate from the people, felt that this was entirely appropriate. Jefferson really believed that the Federalists were a threat to the spirit of 1776. They had betrayed the spirit of 1776. And whatever it took to stop these people who were betraying our revolution, that was fair game. So it's a combination of a kind of populism in Jefferson that you don't see in Washington, you don't see it in Hamilton, you don't see it in John Adams, in part because they were more fearful of the people. Jefferson believed that he could, in a sense, manage, I would say perhaps manipulate the people. And because the threat presented by his opponents was so great, the gloves needed to come off. These people needed to be, this may sound over the top, but I don't think so. These people needed to be destroyed and portrayed as un-American. And by the way, Evan, for the most part, he succeeded, certainly when it came to Hamilton.
How did he get that message out there? How did this manifest itself in the media of its day in the early 1800s?
So he had people literally on his payroll. He had newspapermen, I should say, excuse me, and newspaper editors on his payroll, including some of the greatest scandal mongers of all, a guy by the name of James Callender, who's the one that reveals Hamilton's extramarital affair in 1797. That's how he did it. He had a network of newspapermen who would spread these rumors designed to portray his opponents as un-American, if not outright British agents in the case of Hamilton. And by the way, Evan, Jefferson actually came to believe that George Washington wasn't necessarily a British agent, but had surrendered his principles to Great Britain, or as Jefferson indelicately put it, Washington had become a whore for Great Britain. This is the kind of stuff we're talking about here. This is hard-hitting stuff designed to excommunicate his political opponents.
How do we avoid, this is an aside, but how do we avoid this tendency, I guess, to view our opponents as un-American? It's very common now, but
Yeah.
apparently it's not new. How do we resist the temptation to say that's un-American? And when do we know when something is un-American versus something it's just something we disagree with?
Yeah, that's a terrific one. In a way, that's the biggest question of all. Uh, so much of it comes down to character, your character, my character, the character of the presidents we're talking about. I think you have to see yourself, whether you're a president or just a private citizen. We're all just passing through here. We all don't, we're not God's gift to the American experiment. Um, our fellow citizens who differ with us need to be respected. You need to deal with them through reason. And the last thing you need to do is attack them. But, I'm not adequately answering your question, Evan. It's a tough one. But again, to me, it comes down to character, a sense of humility, a sense of understanding that this regime that we all fortunate to live in, this is an ongoing process. If we want it to continue, we need to get along with our fellow citizens and not view them as the enemy.
I actually like the way you put it. We're not God's gift to the American experiment. We are passing through and we are trying to partake in it as best and as holistically as we possibly can. I think that's a good motivation.
Thank you. Yeah.
All right. I guess we can go to Andrew Jackson now. And it's interesting that Jefferson, while he was sort of a person of high station, that he believed in the power of the people. And Jackson certainly was not a person of high station. This unbelievably hard scrabble beginning, more so than his six predecessors, much more so than any of his six predecessors by a long shot. And here he is as a conspiratorial president, in your view. He believed there was a secretive cabal plotting to subjugate the common man. How did he use the media and understand the media in such a way, even as, not somebody who came up in this world? It allowed him to destroy the banking system, but also to sort of filter his view of populism down nearly 200 years to our present time, where our current president calls him an idol of his.
Yeah. Jackson's an interesting character. As you mentioned, a rough-hewn kind of character, military hero, able to portray himself as a common man, which to some extent he was, although he was also one of the largest slave owners in the state of Tennessee, and actually a fairly wealthy man. But Jackson, from his
But that
earliest
was
time,
later in life, wasn't it? I mean,
correct,
early on, he was an orphan, and yeah,
absolutely,
yeah,
self-made man,
yeah.
no question. But had this kind of burning resentment towards what he saw as East Coast elites, Boston, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C. These people, they were all part of a cabal who were trying to tuck it to the common man. And he legitimately viewed himself as the champion of the common man. Of course, the common man being white and being male. Um, and if you stood in his way, and I've already made this point, you were part of this cabal just by the fact that you opposed him. So there's no such thing as an honest policy difference. If you opposed Andrew Jackson, you were thus part of this secretive cabal, this deep state of sorts, that was determined to tuck it to the common man. And so that led him to endorse tactics because once again, he is the one standing between the common man and those who are betraying the American experiment.
And explain how this was all sort of um, how this was all put out on the banking system, how the banking system became his target, and how he viewed them as part of this enemy, this plotting enemy that was going to take down the United States and the common man with it.
So, being a Southerner, being a man of the frontier, banks were very unpopular in the sort of hinterlands. So, politically speaking, it was a sound move to dislike East Coast-based financial institutions. To this day, by the way, Americans aren't particularly fond of Wall Street. There's still that suspicion that Wall Street and corporate interests pull the strings. Jackson taps into that very American sentiment. But I would add to it, Evan, in the case of the Bank of the United States, which he destroys, the head of the bank, Nicholas Biddle, I mean, even the name itself sounds like this is a guy cut from the establishment, from the best schools and plugged into all these East Coast elites. I will give Jackson some credit. The fact is that Biddle and the bank did exert an inordinate influence over some members of Congress. He knew how to play the political game. He put some of them on the board of directors of the Bank of the United States. They were paid retainers. So, in a sense, that is a form of corruption that Jackson rightly tapped into. So, in this case, in this particular conspiracy theory, there is a grain of truth in what Jackson had to say.
All right, Andrew Johnson, what can you say? Uh, what can you say? Instead of viewing the Reconstruction Amendments and the Civil Rights Acts of the 1860s as a way to level the playing field, he viewed them as a way to create black supremacy in the United States. Was he expressing a common belief, or was he setting the table for that belief to take root?
He was very much expressing a common belief, not only south of the Mason-Dixon line, but a lot of Northerners were uncomfortable with the thrust of those Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, which sought, as you said, to put blacks on an equal playing field with their fellow white citizens. That was a very common view that, in fact, what was happening was the elevation of the freed black slaves over the white working man. And so Johnson was both reflective of a very popular sentiment at the time, and also, just to be blunt about it, and I don't throw this term around loosely, the guy was just an out and out racist and viewed blacks as just incapable of self-government.
Do you view Abraham Lincoln's decision to put him on a ticket as something that could have been avoided, or did Lincoln simply have to calculate that he needed the support of those types of people, and that if he wanted to do anything, he had to stay in office? And of course, he didn't necessarily plan on being assassinated, particularly at that very, very important moment as the Civil War is winding down.
Very sympathetic to Lincoln selecting Johnson. He picked him in part at the behest of Republican Party leaders who told him, Mr. President, you need somebody from the border state to keep a state like Kentucky and Delaware and Maryland, to keep those folks happy. They were slave states, but they stayed in the Union. But, Evan, it's important to point out Lincoln's first vice president, Hannibal Hamlin from Maine, was a dyed-in-the-wool abolitionist. And the whole course of American history would have been very different had Lincoln and the Republicans kept Hamlin on the ticket in 1864. But having said that, I understand the political calculation that went into picking Andrew Johnson, who, by the way, was the only member of a state that seceded who stayed in the United States Senate, who kept his seat.
Did Lincoln know enough? Could he have known enough to know what he was dealing with?
I don't think so, Evan. Those two were not close. Um, Johnson and Lincoln were not close. It was strictly a political calculation that people like William Seward and Thurlow Reed were telling Lincoln. And I think he knew very little about Andrew Johnson, other than the fact that he had remained loyal. And a lot of Northerners were impressed by that fact, that Johnson had stuck with the Union and had not gone to the taken the path of secession.
Politics makes strange bedfellows, I guess. All right, we're going to jump ahead, I guess, 60 more years to Woodrow Wilson. How did our first and only president, interesting fact, our first and only president to have a PhD, become obsessed with what he thought was a minority effort, a black effort to take over his administration? And there's that theme again. How far back did his preoccupation with that set the American battle against segregation? I mean, it really set things back potentially decades, I think.
He did. He did set things back decades. There have been some minor progress in terms of leveling the playing field after the Civil War and with those Civil War amendments. Look, Woodrow Wilson was a son of the South, spent a good part of his youth in both Georgia and Virginia. One of his earliest memories was of seeing Confederate soldiers returning home from the Civil War. He accepted a very predominant view that the newly freed slaves were incapable of self-government, that in fact, according to many whites of that time, these people were far too primitive to live in a modern, quote unquote, society such as ours. So this is another man, I think, who was a captive of racist views of the time. And his administration, as you mentioned, sets the United States back, reverses some of the minimal progress that had been made in terms of putting blacks in federal jobs in the Washington, D.C. area, especially in the post office department. Wilson is going to resegregate the post office and other cabinet departments. And as you know, Evan, he's going to host the screening of that racist film, The Birth of a Nation, which was written by a roommate of his from Princeton. So this is a man who was in the thick of the racial antagonisms of his time and did a tremendous amount of damage to the American political order.
And they literally didn't, I mean, they literally saw white and black federal employees eating together and said, we just can't have this.
Correct, correct. And so, yeah, absolutely.
Um, FDR, it's interesting to see him on this list because his accomplishments are just enormous in the scope of American history. Whether you like his tactics or not, the Great Depression, World War II, those are both things that his more favorable scholars, and there are many of them, say that he helped set the United States on the path to either stopping or to winning. But you do say he went after his opponents domestically in ways that were unhelpful to our system in the long run, particularly when it comes to the business class and to reporters. And it must be said, the Japanese Americans. How could such a reasoned speaker, military thinker, who could also make the case to help the common man in such an incredible way, how did he lose his senses when it came to his opponents?
You know, Evan, I think it goes back to something we've touched on with a couple of these men. FDR was convinced that in a way he was doing the Lord's work. And let me make it clear, I admire FDR for the optimism that he lifted a broken people in the midst of a Great Depression. He assembled a national security team in World War II that was second to none. There's a lot about FDR to admire, but I do think he fell victim to a kind of hubris that says, I'm the one that's going to take us into the promised land. Anybody who speaks out against me is thus somehow corrupt, or somehow, to even go further, evil. And that means anything goes. And so you see it, look, when the Supreme Court objects to some of his New Deal
I was going to say the court packing. Yeah.
Yeah. He takes to the airwaves and basically accuses the Supreme Court of abandoning the American experiment. I mean, he uses some of the harshest public language that any American president has used against the judiciary. You have to get up to Donald Trump before you find somebody willing to punch at the courts the way FDR did. So it's part of this hubris. It's part of this sense that I'm indispensable. You folks are in my way. I'm going to do whatever it takes to get you out of my way. And I'm going to circulate conspiracy theories to help undermine your credibility.
Was Japanese internment a direct outgrowth of that, or was that um, a product of a growing bureaucracy and of other people's fears that ended up putting this piece of paper in front of him to sign?
I wish I could say, Evan, that it was a product of bureaucracy and FDR was sort of either forced into it or just complied for whatever reason. This is a policy driven by FDR himself. J. Edgar Hoover, who's no civil libertarian, opposed the internment. FDR's own Attorney General, Francis Biddle, was opposed to it, said this is too draconian. We can weed out the saboteurs. You don't need to extend this broad net. And it's FDR who said, no, we're going to do this. This is driven by Franklin Roosevelt, and it's a real blot on an otherwise very impressive record.
Jeez. All right. His successor, he inherits an unbelievable situation. He learns about the nuclear bomb shortly after taking office. Here you go. You have a problem, or at least a potential solution, but it's going to be a big deal. And he ultimately grows into the presidency in ways that many people didn't predict. But he sort of set the tone, you argue, for this instinct to call opponents fascist. And we hear it on both sides of our major parties now, the other side's a fascist. But it started with who many people consider now to be a great president.
Harry Truman, who again is somebody I admire, as you said, the whole weight of the republic put on his shoulders out of the blue. He had not been part of FDR's inner circle, so he didn't even know, as you mentioned, he didn't even know about the atomic bomb. So he did a great job in a number of ways. Unfortunately, when he runs for election in 1948, in this vaunted whistle stop campaign that Americans have heard about, and most Americans think or revere this case of the president appealing directly to the people, he goes out there and portrays Thomas Dewey and the Republican Party, as you mentioned, as fascist. And even equates some of the people around Dewey to some of the people who were around Hitler. And it's demagoguery of the worst kind. And it goes back to a question you asked earlier, Evan. Why do some biographers, some historians not deal with this stuff? And a perfect example of this is David McCullough's book, God rest his soul. I admired McCullough's work, but there's very little in there about the demagoguery in McCullough's book on Truman that Truman used during that whistle stop campaign. And I think it's because McCullough fell in love with Truman. And again, if you fall in love with somebody like this and you think they're a great person, you're going to leave such a negative aspect of their career, on the cutting room floor.
Richard Nixon, coastal elites and Jewish people. I want to know, those were at least his fears. They were plotting against him. What was in his youth or in his rocky, very up and down career where he rises quickly and then fails and has to go back to repair himself in California? What is in those early roots that led him to always be looking over his shoulder?
Yeah, another terrific question. And I'm not sure I'm going to be able to adequately answer it because we would need to put Richard Nixon on the couch, so to speak, and examine him for days on end. But look, Henry Kissinger once said about Nixon, Nixon was an introvert in an extrovert's business. And I do think that was true. Nixon loved the thinking about international relations. He was well read. He was a thinker of sorts. But for the rough and tumble world of politics, he was just not cut out for it. And one of the key events, one of the key sort of scars I think on Nixon's psyche occurs in 1960 when John F. Kennedy narrowly defeats Nixon for the presidency. In Nixon's mind, Kennedy was, good looking, came from a lot of money, didn't have to work his way up, was a womanizer, went to Harvard, God forbid. All of those things led Nixon to it just preyed on Nixon's view of himself as somebody who had never been given a break, somebody who was born into a poor family, who probably couldn't have gotten into Harvard, who had to fight his way up. And this is just a man who, once he was scarred, once he was hurt by something, it never went away. And so you mentioned his antipathy towards Jews, towards folks from Harvard. Anyone associated with the Kennedys was also immediately suspect in Nixon's mind. This is
Hearing
again just a deeply scarred individual.
hearing you talk about his sort of resentment or jealousy of the Kennedys makes me think of that log cabin that you go to at his library. Um, and that's his youth. That
Yeah,
is, it's amazing to have this little log cabin right next to a presidential library, but that is the story of Nixon's life. That's the arc of it.
yeah, yeah. As he begins one of his memoirs by saying, "I was born in a house my father built." And I think it was one of these like Sears things that you bought
Yes,
and you
yes.
put the pieces together.
Yeah.
And John F. Kennedy is sitting in Hyannisport eating, lobster. It's just two very, what we keep coming back. One of the consistent themes here is, with the exception of FDR and Trump, this antipathy towards the East Coast amongst, and particularly Ivy League wealthy East Coasters. It's a steady theme here, and Nixon fits into that as well.
Yeah. All right. So we're at the modern record holder here. Donald Trump. You lambast him in this book. He's Hank Aaron and Babe Ruth and Barry Bonds all in one. Um, I want to ask in this case, not necessarily about him because we all get to study him every minute of every day, but I want to ask about the public. Did you find yourself eager to write this book because of the impact that 12 years of President Trump being sort of in charge of our national discussion or setting the tone at least for our national discussion? 12, is it 12 years now? Yeah, it's basically 12 years. And his belief in conspiracy theories, the constant conspiracy theories that he talks about. Did you want to write this book because of the impact that has had on our public and on our discourse?
Absolutely, I think that's the primary reason, Evan. I'm 68 years. I'll be 69 in a couple of months. I have three young grandchildren. I'm very concerned about the fate of our republic. I want these grandchildren of mine to grow up in a country that's similar to the one I grew up in. And I'm worried. I'm worried because for the first time, I think we have, despite everything we've just talked about, Trump, as you said, is in a league of his own. And we have Americans are divided over what just some basic truths. And as Lincoln would say, a house divided like that can't stand for long. So when you have millions and millions of Americans believe that the election of 2020 was stolen, or that illegal
To
immigrants
the
are
point where
eating,
they took action, it should be said.
yeah, exactly. An insurrection, an attempt to disrupt the certification of the Electoral College. That is a remarkably disturbing event that was fostered by this president. And the kind of contempt for reason, the contempt for the rule of law, let's just say, in my view, a contempt for the Constitution. Um, and the fact that millions of people support this man, it's upsetting to me. That's exactly why I wrote this book. Trump doesn't, he's not our founding demagogue. He's not our founding conspirator in chief, but he's taken it to lengths that none of the other people we talked about would even dream of.
Why does race seem to be a theme with so many of these conspiracy presidents? Is there enough to draw a conclusion about the country?
Sadly, Evan, I think there is enough to draw a conclusion about the country in that many Americans, while they may pay lip service to the principles that all men are created equal and to the other principles found in the Declaration, we don't always live it and we don't always breathe it. We don't always incorporate that view into our lives. And I do think race is the original sin of the American Republic. It's still an incredible factor in our political life. And it saddens me to say that, but I think we have to face reality.
All right, who gets the Knott Award? Who are the anti conspiracy theory presidents? Who should be applauded? Who are the gold medal winners here? I feel like you're going to say JFK. I feel like you're going to say Lincoln, but I want to hear who are the winners going back to number one to 47.
Yeah, the winner, I mean, George Washington avoided this kind of conspiracy mongering. He didn't stir the pot. Yes, there were some pro-Federalist, pro-Washington newspapers, but he's not feeding them gossip about his opponents. He's a very restrained and sober chief executive when it comes to his rhetoric. John Quincy Adams as well. He's going to be beaten by Andrew Jackson in 1828, in part because he doesn't play Jackson's game. He doesn't try to stir the pot. He doesn't play on racial antagonisms toward free blacks or towards Native Americans. He's a very dignified, restrained president. In my view, he's somebody who needs to be celebrated more than he is. Lincoln as well. If there's any president who had a reason to hate, Jefferson Davis, for instance, there's not a single statement in the entire duration of Lincoln's presidency where he says anything negative about Jefferson Davis or any Confederates.
That's surreal.
It is surreal. And in fact, he says these are still our fellow citizens. This man had a sense of magnanimity, had a sense of charity towards all, he is in many ways, I think, the ultimate role model. Closer to home, William Howard Taft, not exactly a household name, but he avoided that kind of personal politics, going after your opponents to try to destroy them. Eisenhower also, I think, practiced that kind of restraint. Eisenhower had a great relationship with Lyndon Johnson and other members of the Democratic opposition. He didn't view them as the enemy or somehow un-American. John F.
Clearly
Kennedy,
helped JFK during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Kennedy, as you mentioned, we've already touched on him. The one that may surprise a lot of folks, maybe it caught you off guard, Evan, was I've got George W. Bush in there. And the reason I included Bush, and I think this is very important, in the wake of 9/11, there were calls, not just in conservative circles, but amongst many Americans to do something, I don't know what that something would have been, against Islamic Americans who were suddenly viewed with suspicion. And Bush rejected that right from the start. There was not going to be any internment of suspected Islamic American subversives. He flat out, he was well aware of what FDR had done to Japanese Americans. There was a member of Bush's cabinet, Norman Mineta, who was Secretary of Transportation, who had been interned during FDR. And Bush would cite Mineta's experience and say, we are not going down that path. And so within a week of 9/11, Bush shows up at a mosque in Washington, D.C., puts his arm around the imam of that mosque and says, these are our fellow citizens and they're going to be treated with respect. And we're not going to take vengeance against these people. For me, that is the ultimate rejection of a kind of conspiratorial view, which would have said, oh, we can't trust these people. We need to round them up.
I remember that moment very clearly. Very clearly among the haze of those awful days. I
Yeah,
remember very clearly him saying, these are not internal enemies we're fighting right now.
yeah, absolutely.
All right. What can we do to spot fear mongering and conspiracy theory as we move into the future with all of this knowledge banked up behind us?
Yeah, well, again, ultimately, this is all on us as voters, as citizens. We have an obligation to get ourselves up to speed on the issues, not just listen to sound bites, not just listen to talk radio, not just listen to, not this podcast, of course, but other podcasts that, this is all that they do. It's to prey on vulnerable minority groups or to prey on elites that are supposedly tucking it to us. That's just so easy to do, but it's not. Citizens need to use their reason. They need to do their civic duty, which means paying attention to a variety of news sources or reading books or listening to podcasts like this. It all comes down to us. And if somebody's constantly appealing to stuff that gets our blood flowing, that's the warning sign. That's the red flag.
And it does seem like there could be a realignment if the world was a perfect world of putting those who are wary of conspiracy theory on one team.
There could be, and I yearn for the day when we will get a candidate. I don't know if it'll come out of either party at this point, which is one of my concerns about Trump. So many young people think this is the way it is, always is, and it doesn't have to be this way. I'm yearning for a candidate someday who says, look, I'm not going to promise you the world. I'm not going to portray my opponents as un-American or corrupt. I'm going to try to appeal to your reason, and we're going to try to get things done. I think that message might succeed, but we'll have to see, Evan. I wish I could be more optimistic for you.
Your dedication is lengthy. It says, for all the elementary and high school educators I've come to know and admire through the Masters in American History and Government program at Ashland University and through the Teaching American History program, the survival of self-government depends on your vital work in the nation's classrooms, and I remain forever grateful for all you have taught me and for all you do for our republic. Why did you want to include them in such a prominent place in your book? Just tell us a little bit of the backstory there.
Sure. I've been teaching for 20 years at a program through Ashland University in Ohio. It's a program from elementary and high school teachers in history and civics, or history and government. It's been one of the most rewarding, one of the most fulfilling experiences of my life. These people, Evan, are literally on the front lines trying to bring our fellow citizens up to speed on just some of the basics of American government, how it works, what the founders intended, the importance of the rule of law, the importance of the Constitution. If we're going to get out of this mess, and I do see it as a mess, we're going to have citizens who, as I just said, understand some important principles about what it means to live in a liberal democracy and how important it is that all of us view our fellow citizens with respect and listen to their arguments and realize we're all in this together. These teachers that I've dedicated this book to do that, try to do that day in and day out.
What's next? Are there still more books for you?
Yeah, it's a great question, Evan. I don't have anything on my plate at the moment, and if you've got any good ideas, I'm more than happy to listen to what you might have to say.
All right, I'm gonna have to think about that. I'll send you a message on Facebook, which has become our method of
Yes, right.
communication. Dr. Stephen Knott, the author of Conspirator in Chief, the long tradition of conspiracy theories in the American presidency. Thank you so much for being here. Your third appearance on the show. In order to get ahead of those other 3 or 4 people I mentioned, you've got to write a fourth, and we'll have you back for 4.
Great. Thank you, Evan.
Check
I'll get
out
on it today.
It was great to have you. Check out the book and also his website, which is stephenfknott.com. Axelbankhistory.com is designed by Nikki Rideout of Ellie Claire Designs. It has our most recent episodes, our featured episodes, and also a link to that Patreon page. So check out Nikki's work and go to that Patreon page to support children's literacy. We make a donation every year with a part of those donations to help children's literacy, particularly in the Tampa Bay area, but also in the United States at large. And thank you for listening to Axelbank Reports, History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axelbank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.